Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Tackling Sport Podcast. I'm your host Sean Hussey, joined alongside as always by my brother Daniel. Daniel, how are you getting on?
Not too bad, Sean. Ryder Cup fever. This time tomorrow we'll be watching it and glued to it for 3 days. So looking forward to that. All right, but plenty of sport happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Ryder Cup week, and if you are just joining the channel here, make sure to check out our preview that we did on Monday night. Brilliant preview with Conor Nolan and Mark from the Plug Lie. So we're going to discuss rugby, Dan. We're going to discuss the United Rugby Championship. I mean, this competition has had a lot of names gone by. I think Magners was my first memory of it. Dan, maybe you might explain why it's in the news and what the new format is bringing and what they're trying to implement.
Yeah. So just to go through the names. So the Celtic League, the Magners League, the RaboDirect Pro12, the Guinness Pro12. You actually had the Guinness Pro14, and last year the Guinness Pro14 Rainbow Cup. So it's a league that's kind of been messed around a lot through various sponsorship. They've tried to include Italian teams in, and now they're trying to include South African teams. They kind of hastily did that last year. But yeah, I kind of had a good look at this during the week. Yeah, my initial thought, I was like, why are they changing the format again? Is this going to complicate everything? You're looking for the casual fan, which is what the backers have said they want here, and you're complicating with a format. But kind of digging deep, I actually think this will work. So there's 16 teams now. So the Irish teams, the Scottish teams, the Welsh teams, and the two Italian teams are now joined by 4 South African teams this time. So you've got the Sharks, the Stormers, the Lions, and the Bulls. And so basically they're split into the 4 countries. The 4 countries. So you obviously have you have Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and Italian, and then South African. So what that is, basically whoever wins those groups qualify for Europe and the Champions Cup. And then the rest of it is decided by the 4 next best teams. So that's kind of created a little bit of controversy because the French and English teams want as many different countries involved in the competition as possible in the European competition. But that's kind of looking like they're trying to shut out as many Irish teams as they can. Now, the actual format is pretty simple. You play every team once, but you play every team in your pool, or what they call a shield, twice. So for those like fans of Munster and Leinster, you're getting the Munster-Leinster twice a year. You're getting Leinster-Ulster twice a year. You're getting Leinster-Connacht twice a year. And you play every other team once. So that leads to 15 games, 12 against the other side. That leads to 18 games, 12 against the other sides, and then 2 each against the teams in your pool, like I said. And then it's just top 8 qualify for quarterfinals. And all this will play post-European action in June. So it's going to be like basically super weeks, quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals. So again, looking at that, that's, it sounds a bit all right, sounds a little bit more simple. But I guess the kind of main things is just the backing this tournament is getting. I looked at RT and TG Carr heavily involved. 52 out of the 60 games involving Irish provinces will be shown live, either on RT or TG Carr. And this is all, they're thinking the more free to air games they show, that means that more people will purchase the streaming services, which is the URC TV. And that's where all 151 games are involved. And another kind of change on the calendar is that the European games don't actually start until December. So it looks like the URC is getting a good run of things. And the last thing to talk about on the league is not going to clash with internationals anymore. So you'd be at a Leinster game and there'd be an Ireland game on the following day in the same city. It was kind of a bit of madness when you think about it. They've got rid of that now. So now it won't clash with internationals. The season has a bit of a run of itself before the European competition comes in. And all of this is to try and maybe, the top 14 and the the Galera Premiership is very big in France and England respectively. They're trying to make this as big as possible, or even bigger than European games, because they've no really option. They're kind of being backed into a corner because the French and English teams much prefer them. They make a lot more money in their domestic leagues than European. So a lot of politics at play. A lot of it's been done for money. However, I do think this could have a bit of benefits given the free to air thing, given to the top 8. So yeah, I suppose one last thing the Irish teams do have a problem with is the fact that for European qualification, you could finish top 8, right? And say Benetton finish 9th, right? So they get the European spot. And maybe, I don't know, Scarlets miss out, right? Scarlets could end up winning the whole thing and not be in the Champions Cup the following year. Do you know what I mean? Because they'd have qualified for the quarterfinals, but not made the European places. So there's a lot of maybe complications going on, but I do think rugby fans should give this a chance, and they're targeting the casual sports fans, the likes of myself, yourself, Sean, and plenty of people who listen to the podcast. It'll be very interesting how they get on. And I do think it could ultimately work out, because I think there'll be a lot more publicity around the place and a lot more investment here, given the free to air and then the potentially streaming services as well. So it'll all be interesting how it plays. Will the highlight packages be available on YouTube straight after, stuff like that? You see the benefit of that in the Premier League. Well, will it carry over with the rugby side of things here?
Okay, so that's for those listening. This is what the new system is trying to bring, and I think some of the key points you mentioned out there. A no fixture scheduled during the international windows. That's either the November Test series that each of the Six Nations sides play, and then during next spring Six Nations there won't be any games, and they're trying to make sure the best players are playing. In that, Dan, and again, some of the important information for people, and I think the accessibility of this is maybe what they're trying to go at. So both RT and TG Car are going to have games. They're going to be on free to air terrestrial television as well as across the other countries. And the streaming option, so one of the key components of the URC is they've launched URC TV. So you can get a weekend pass, I think it's €20, or you can get an All Ireland pass. So you can £100 to watch every minute of the Ireland games that are in, or a further £20 to watch all the games in the season. So I think this is ultimately a new system, a system with the streaming options that we might see tested across other sports. So there's a lot of talk in other sports that they can produce their own rights, and maybe something we might see in GA in the future. How do you think it's going to work in rugby? Now, there is a lot of games, so you might see, your core rugby fans picking up the big packages, but, how are we going to anticipate, are people going to pay £20 to watch Leinster Munster over the weekend, or do you think that's with the streaming and the free to air, that's where that comes in, and you're trying to attract interest in the overall league and the brand?
Yeah, what you said second is spot on. So again, what was the stat I read out earlier? It's 52 out of the 60 games the Irish provinces will play this year will be on RT or TG Car, and I think that's a big part, because realistically you won't get that many fans right now to pay for it. And this dates back to all the way to the rugby kind of spent a lot of time going behind the paywall, and it's sort of backfired. Rugby's never had the following football has. Rugby's on a par with cricket, so you need to be having free to air if you want the next generation to be playing rugby, to then watch rugby and pay to watch rugby. So I think they've almost got to start from scratch here and say, right, we're doing free to air TV here. Let's try and build more and more of a platform here. It's great that RTE are involved, because while TG Car is a big part of it, the viewing figures, even compared from RT to Virgin Media or TG Car, it's like RT is just trumps them every day of the week. You see that in the top 20 most watched TV programs, but in general, the average is far higher if you have RT on board. So it's great they have RT on board. Again, the whole goal for the URC is ultimately to get more people watching on the stream. Again, bar the hardcore rugby fan, you're not going to get anyone now, but I guess their job is to try and promote this as best they can, because it's not going to happen overnight, because we're so used to in the rugby calendar. When we grew up, Sean, watching Heineken Cup, you had your 2 games in October. Didn't you have your 2 games in December after November internationals? And then you had your 2 games in January. And it was a brilliant pool phase, 20 teams. And then basically the top, wasn't it 5 pools or 6 pools? And then the best 2 runners up. And what that led to, or 5 pools, sorry. So it's 5 pools and the best 3 runners up. And it was just so competitive. The quarterfinals then were in April. It's all changed now. And because the Europeans not starting until December, will people buy into the URC? It's hard to say. I know whatever about Irish attendances, which, by and large weren't great, obviously compared to their European games, but they're still high enough. You're watching Glasgow and you're watching Edinburgh and empty stadiums, so it's not just Irish teams that have got to be worried here. It's the broad picture, but it is it'll be very fascinating given how the South African teams will get on. Sharks, Stormers, Lions and Bulls. At the moment, they don't have their South African players because they're involved in the Rugby Championship at the moment. They've actually been in a bubble since the Lions tour, would you believe? And I think that goes on till October the 2nd. And then they have the November internationals. So that's a little bit messy to start with, because while it won't clash with any of the internationals, that's European internationals at the moment. It's clashing with the South African side of things. So I don't know if you'll always have that problem every year with the Rugby Championship, but it'll be interesting how they get on there. But look, it's worth a go. It is a league that's been messed around a lot. And another new format, it's a bit annoying, but last year they 2 tables. Casual sports fan, you just tune it, your head goes, you tune it, you look at the Premier League, you know what I mean? We're here now, you've got 1 table again. People can look and see where the teams are getting on. The top 8 qualify. It's pretty simple. European qualification will figure itself out. I know the Irish teams are not happy, and that's only going to be a 2-year thing at the moment. where they'll review that after 2 years, whether it will just be directly the top 8, because I think the Leinster CEO and other CEOs in Ireland voted against it, but they were vetoed. So that's a kind of interest in the politics side of things, because it is unfair, I guess, if you finish 8th, like I mentioned earlier, the example, and end up winning the URC, but you won't qualify for the Champions Cup, would make a bit of a mockery of the whole thing. So for the URC's future, I hope that doesn't happen. But I can come around to it a little bit, I think. And, the first weeks, I think Munster and Leinster playing South African teams, good chance. I think there'll be a bit of traction on it this weekend, albeit they're going up against the Ryder Cup in the Premier League. But that'll always be the case with the Premier League anyway.
So do get your comments in. We've got a few comments in that we'll get into. One of the ones that maybe will become an interesting, so this is what Tim Stokes says, league has become an academy project, very little atmosphere in the stadiums at games. You alluded to that, Dan. He doesn't like the playoff format, takes the competitiveness out of week-to-week games. Now, one of the big, I suppose, bonuses in the last few years has been the likes of Leinster, who've been able to use an awful lot of their academy players while Ireland or the Lions have been on, and the leagues have run through, and a lot of academy players have got their debuts for Leinster and have gone on to kickstart and maybe be a part of Leinster's success. Do you see, your key Leinster players, your likes of Jack Cohn and Johnny Sexton, playing week in, week out, or do you still think there'll be an element of, Leinster and Leo Cullen looking to build and kind of use that massive squad in their academy to make sure that they're, continuing their success? I think they've won 4 in a row. They've really dominated this competition. They've won it 8 times. They're just continually building an unbelievable squad, and that's being one of their strengths. Do you still think that, week in, week out, you're going to have your top Irish internationals playing?
It'll be a lot less academies brought in, or academy players brought in, given the international side of things. And I think, I'm not sure how this will filter down to the first teams, but I know it's kind of been reiterated to the teams here. You got to play as best teams as you have possible. And, they're going to try and, like, the quote is, they're going to, there's a great article, which we'll actually link in the description on the podcast tomorrow morning, on the 42. And they're kind of saying, we want to promote the players sort of thing. We're going to push the players. The players going to be part of this. So if that's the case, you got to have Johnny Sexton, albeit his age, needs to be playing week in, week out, as best he can. Like, given the schedule with the November internationals, the Six Nations, it's pretty hectic, so that's unlikely. And if you're going to give someone a rest, it's going to be in the URC. But maybe all of Leinster's home games, you need Johnny Sexton playing. Do you know what I mean? So there will definitely it'll be a lot harder for an academy graduate right now to break into Leinster's team, given this new format, given it doesn't clash with internationals. And that was always a big thing. You'd still get a good attendance in the RDS, and there'd be the academy players playing, but it was a great opportunity for them. You might miss a bit of that, but I think ultimately what they're trying to do here is promote the game beyond the hardcore rugby fan here and maybe the casual fan. Because if you're a casual fan, right, and you're tuning in to watch Leinster home to Dragons, and you see Johnny Sexton's not playing, you might look elsewhere. If you see Johnny Sexton's playing, you're right, all right, the big guns are out today. Do you know what I mean? So, and that's where they're going to try and pick out those casual fans to get the viewership, and their hope is eventually that'll lead to more people buying the streaming service, but ultimately that'll lead to more people maybe participating in rugby, supporting rugby, and maybe getting out to watch the Leinster games and the Munster games and Connacht and Ulster games. So to answer your question, there will definitely be a lot less rotation. It'll be the internationals are going to be playing a lot more regularly, given obviously the obvious thing. And I think it was a big thing, and I was quite surprised they were able to do it, given that the amount of games they have to play. But they've kind of scheduled it up there now. I think there's plenty of games now between now and the end of October till the November internationals. And then you've obviously around Christmas, you're going to have the Interpros and stuff like that after the European competition. So there's actually a good bit of a break from like October to December, I think, to play the November internationals, the European games. They'll then be played the Interpros, then they'll be back out to European games. So then you've got the Six Nations. So there are going to be breaks in the season where you build up a bit of momentum, which again, I think they asked for here, particularly that October period. Yet there's always going to be breaks in the seasons. But I think that'll always be the case if you've November internationals and the Six Nations where they are in the calendar, and they'll never move. But I do think they're ultimately going to try and compete with the European competition as best they can, I think, and try and make it as good a domestic league as possible. And again, you're looking at the casual sports fan. In 2 or 3 months, will we be tuning in January, or will we be tuning in March sort of time, at the end of March after Six Nations? Who knows? But I do think it's worth trying to put some money behind this and try and make it work. But I do think ultimately there will be more stronger teams as a result. But look, towards the end of the season, if top 8 qualify and Leinster have top 8 wrapped up, which they probably will, you'll probably see a few academy players as well.
So one of the questions we got here as well, is from Emmet Deeney, which is the new South African teams do you expect to be the most competitive? And
Yeah.
also just before on that, Dan, there's a lot of talk around the Six Nations with Italy and their stance and what is the end goal for Italian rugby, and they've had a couple of glory days, but they just the consistency isn't there, and it's really hampering the actual championship. It's about who can beat Italy by the most. Now they've had a number of teams from Italy since 2010 compete in the as it was then the Celtic League, now the URC. They've two at the moment now. Often you see these games, and Leinster or Munster, they're beating them by a cricket score. There is that element to it as well, where Italy and Italian rugby, is it almost I'm not sure what the right word here is, but it's almost a hindrance to the actual competitiveness of the Six Nations and of the URC.
Yeah, like I think the Bulls will be pretty strong this year, just on the South African side of things. Like the four teams are the Bulls, the Shark, the Stormers, and the Lions. A lot stronger than last year's two teams, so it'll definitely be more competitive. With the Italian side of things, yeah, like that's always a problem when you're trying to promote. Like even you see the Six Nations, how disgraced. Like Italy are actually getting worse. I don't know if Italy are getting worse or the teams are getting stronger, but they're like they were always whipping boys, but they've gotten even. It's yeah, like you said, they're whipping boys in the Six Nations side of things. They're pretty poor here, and the problem you'll have with the European competition is French and English sides want a team from Scotland or Italy to qualify for the European competition. So realistically, you're looking at a situation where Connacht, if they're fourth this year out of the four Irish sides, will potentially miss out to a Benetton who finish 10th or 11th. Do you know what I mean, or 9th or 10th? So yeah, like you'll always get this mismatch. I guess there's no other alternative to maybe like having these two Italian teams in here. I do think like having the four South African teams makes it a lot more interesting. Also, the fact they can now qualify for the Champions Cup gives them something to play for outside of just this tournament. So yeah, like this will always be the case. You've got to try and promote the sport in Italy as best you can. I don't know if they're doing much themselves there. I always think Georgia should get a crack of the whip in the Six Nations, and there should be relegation in the Six Nations. Talk about that for a second, but it's a closed shop. And again, like most of these decisions, not just the Six Nations not having relegation, but the URC coming up here, it's all ultimately to do with money. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, but Italian teams, yeah, they're weak, but you're always gonna get that. Like when Leinster at home to one of them, it's a tough watch, particularly now if they have play all their internationals. So because they used to just play their academy players a lot. But
Yeah, so that's some of the challenges faced now. I want to touch on rugby in Ireland as a whole, because the glory years under Joe Schmidt, maybe prior to that World Cup, the Six Nations games were some of the biggest sporting events of the season. You go to 2014, 15, 16 in Ireland's success, and the team built off the success that the Grand Slam in 2009 was. There almost seems to be at the moment, after Joe Schmidt and after the World Cup, and just a couple of bad results, and it just feels like the drain has gone out of Irish rugby, and maybe that feel good factor. Now there is an element that we have some of the best talent in the world, but there is again questions of the lack of Simon Zebo in an Ireland jersey, and some of the decision that has been called. Andy Farrell's now at the helm in the men's side. It does feel like an interesting time for Irish rugby, and they maybe quite haven't kicked on as much as they would have liked from, like I said, the Joe Schmidt era, and the success that seemed to be every year in the Six Nations.
yeah, I guess like the Joe Smith era, like it's so much promise, and kind of just ended with the whimper. Like all good Irish managers, the World Cup was ultimately gets them. The fact Ireland have never got to that World Cup semi-final. I know I was listening to Paul O'Connor on the Late Show a few weeks ago, and he was saying, we're not driven by World Cups himself, and the players aren't talking about it, and the squads aren't talking about it. But again, going back to what the URC is trying to promote the game to here, the casual Irish sports or the casual general sports fan, they look at that Irish team, and it's hard to get behind when every year that you don't make the World Cup semi-final. And no matter how many Six Nations you win, albeit I'm one of Six Nations, it'll all come down to not being able to kick on that World Cup every 4 years. And it's just, like even with like say soccer, for example, at least you have the Euros every 2 years, and now they're trying to make the World Cup every 2 years as well. But with the World Cup in rugby, it's every 4 years. We haven't managed to get to a semi-final, and then that feel good factor kind of gets on, and there's like that culture war every 4 years, isn't there? You know, like I think everyone gets behind the Six Nations, but as soon as the Irish team doesn't do well, the Irish rugby team, you get the Hugh McKennas of this world out and about, and then you get the Irish soccer team versus the Irish rugby team, or why the Irish rugby team on this pedestal and all that, and it just doesn't help rugby trying to promote itself. And look, again, will this have an impact on, like, it could have an impact on the promotion of the sport in this country, but we got to remember rugby's predominantly played by private schools, not just in Ireland, but in England. And if they want to break the casual sports fan, they've got to try and, I don't know, promote the sport outside of private schools as well. Do you know what I mean? Like, we went to a public school, we didn't see rugby ball in both primary school or secondary school. Like, how are you meant to promote the sport when it's not in every single school in the country, you know? And it's fine if they want to just go down the road of, you know, promoting it to their market, that's fine. But there's a lot of casual sports fans like yourselves that grew up loving rugby and not playing rugby, but watching rugby. That's one side of things that we never got to play in school. And the second side of things is the BT Sport deal, which I always go back to in the Heineken Cup, was that, you know, I used to watch every single game in the Heineken Cup because it was on Sky Sports. They split it with BT Sport. And it's not like the Premier League where people are going to go out of their way to watch Premier League on BT Sport. Rugby hasn't got that appeal. And then they ended up pushing it all on BT Sport. But again, a lot of casual sports fans just have Sky Sports from my kind of like studies and understanding of it. So they kind of lost a lot of casual sports fans there, and I think they're trying to get them back with this URC. Will be interesting how it goes. But yeah, the Ireland rugby team, it all comes back to the World Cup, doesn't it? And not getting to those semi-finals.
Yeah, and I think to give the IRFU maybe a little bit of credit and a bit of backing, I think the decision to not have the World Cup in Ireland in 2023 was a massive, you know, dagger in the heart, and to have it in France, 16 years I think it will be after it was last held there. You know, you talk there about the accessibility of rugby and this idea that, you know, you the can't see can't be moving it. If you were to have, you know, a World Cup in Ireland, you know, like it was tilted around the country in all these different stadiums, and not just maybe set in Dublin or in Limerick in those traditionally rugby strong areas, or up in Belfast. I think if you're the IRFU, you really feel like that was the time to kick on and get the feel good factor and have a festival of rugby here. And, you know, the way that the bid kind of ended and the way everything happened, it did feel like the air out of the balloon and the air out of the bubble of Irish rugby at that time kind of burst. And that's, you know, looking back, we could look back in maybe 10 or 15 years and see that was a really massive loss to Irish rugby.
Well, even the Limerick example you give, you know, 15 years ago, everyone was playing rugby and talking about rugby, and what's everyone talking about now? It's the hurling. You know?
Yeah.
So it's almost like, I don't know if that's just a Limerick doing so well or a combination of the two, but I think it's something like hurling country sort of thing there. Yeah, they missed. I think there was probably a missed opportunity in that World Cup. Like, to host a World Cup would have been a great opportunity to unite the country. I don't think as a facilities wise, we're probably still a little bit short, albeit a Rugby World Cup. Yeah, that would have been a massive opportunity. Rugby's got to have that kind of moment, and maybe that would be doing well the next World Cup, getting to a semi-final. Like, there is still a buzz about the Rugby World Cup. It's nothing obviously compared to the soccer team in international tournaments.
Well, Dan, let me just explain, maybe to refresh the mind of listeners. Like, the bid was about was to have the final in Croke Park, but to have games in Páirc Uí Chaoimh, to have pool games and quarterfinals in Fitzgerald Stadium in Killarney, pool games in McHale Park, Casement Park, Nolan Park, Tolman Park, Pearse Stadium, Celtic Park in Derry, the RDS and Kingspan. So you have all these dotted around the country. You would have had this festival of rugby that is accessible to so many different people, and it was kind of sold down the river in the end. But it does feel like, you know, even the more you think about it and the more you look at it, maybe the facilities weren't there. But for Ireland's stance in World Rugby as well, and Ireland's, you know, hosting the All Blacks and hosting the South Africas and the Australias of this world and hosting in the Six Nations, that, like, if the IRFU are looking back at it and having a kind of a crisis meeting, like, it's hard to really put a finger on where did it go wrong, and is it too easy to say it was just the stadiums?
Yeah, and the frustrating thing is, like, France held the World Cup in 2007, and what, 11, 15, 19. So 4 editions later, they get the World Cup again, and there was probably an opportunity there if Ireland had the right bid, or, maybe there's a bit more work with the GA, but the GA were on board with that. It's probably a lost cause, I know. Yeah, like you the way you list out those stadiums there was probably the capabilities of having that, and the GA seemed on board, but for whatever reason, we didn't manage to get it. Again, the rugby kind of needs this unite the country side of things. They alien, like, I do think they're small bit tone deaf. Like, some of the, this is rugby country and all, upset a lot of non-rugby people. Like, I'm in both circles, so I can understand it. Like, that's tone deaf because we're not rugby country right now. So you got to try and promote the sport in other ways without kind of just telling everyone you're rugby country now. Again, I go back to my point. The vast majority of this country never saw rugby ball in school at all. And then they're kind of told you have to get on board with this rugby country side of things. So again, the World Cup comes up, the culture wars kind of start again, and you kind of get this mess. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, the 2023 World Cup was a missed opportunity. And again, to have France hosting it twice in 4 editions kind of shows you, or 5 editions shows you the probably missed opportunity that was there, to be fair. One thing, just to see a comment there, Sean, on the rule changes sort of thing. This is one I actually really like. It's if you kick it, let me just double check. It's the 50-22 rule is the main one that's coming in. So basically, the attacking team will now be rewarded with the line out if the ball is kicked from their own half and it bounces into touch inside the opposition 22. So I'd say Ronan O'Gara wouldn't mind having a few years back, because the amount of times he managed to pull that off. And I guess it kind of stretches the game a small bit, because one thing we haven't talked about is the style of play of rugby. That Lions tour was appalling to watch this year, the style of play. And I think by and large, rugby has kind of a problem with that sort of entertainment factor as well.
Yeah, so let's move on to that, okay, but before we head off, I mean, the Lions this year, a bit of a damn squid, I think is probably fair to say. No fans obviously in the stadium. What should be the greatest, what they say, the greatest tour. You're off with your friends, you're representing, your family, and the fact that there was no one in the stadiums would have definitely affected them. But there is that question lingering over, and has been lingered over the Irish rugby side, maybe for the men's side for the last year or two, is to attract the next the next generation. You have to play an exciting form of rugby. You have to, a lot of offloads and keeping the ball alive, I think, is what Ronan O'Gara calls it, and his La Rochelle side are doing that ever so well. And then you look at the Irish side, and it is very rigid. It's, a large part of the game is kicking, and it's just not that exciting to watch or exhilarating to watch. And it's, we aren't seeing those key moments of skill, or that little bit of individual brilliance that, when we were growing up, we would have been very lucky. There was that famous Brian O'Driscoll try against New Zealand, and the skill he used to produce. And it does feel like rugby is devoid of that, not just maybe across the board, but particularly in the Lion series, and what we've become accustomed to watching under the new regime with Ireland, and maybe even the last few years of Joe Schmidt.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Simon Zebo, and I guess he's back with Munster now, so that'll be an excitement factor. And he was always one of those players get your head off your get you off your seat sort of thing. But he actually didn't make Andy Farrell's 50 man squad for the training camp they had there a couple of days ago ahead of the November international. So I don't know if he's waiting for him to see how Simon gets on with Munster. But yeah, like rugby has had this problem for the last few years. It's just because the players are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It almost feels like, not too dissimilar to where the GA was maybe a few years ago, that the pitch is too small given the amount of players on the pitch. Like, you've got 30 lads, or you got 15 lads you got to go by, but there's 30 lads in such a smaller space. Like, you consider how big a GA pitch is compared to a rugby pitch. Like, rugby pitch is barely bigger than a soccer pitch. Do you know what I mean? And they have 22 players on. Rugby is 30 players. GA is bigger again, and they have 30 players. So the sheer size, and there's something we haven't talked about, the rugby players are getting so much bigger given the amount of strength and conditioning that's happening at schools rugby in Ireland, for example, if we just want to talk about Ireland. But then you get to a level where there's so much strength and conditioning that you kind of lose that small bit of speed because you're so big. Like, you look at like the Irish backs now compared to maybe 10 years ago, like, do you know what I mean? The sheer size comparison is there. So, but like every time you tune in to watch a rugby game now, like, and again, I go back to the Lions tour because that's probably the most recent one I watched in the summer. It was just so boring. It was like, and look, the behind closed doors didn't help. And if you compare it to what's on this week, which is the Ryder Cup was scheduled to take place last year. They waited to this year, and now they're going to have 40,000 USA fans on, so they've been rewarded for that. And the Lions tour didn't do that, despite the, rising cases in South Africa. Now I understand, like, there wasn't, so much of a spike after the Tokyo Olympics, but there was in South Africa. So you can't really link the two. But like the vast majority of the South African players got COVID, so it was just a bit of a mess altogether. The warm up tests were brutal, and then the 3-line tests were pretty poor. And Warren Gatland's management, which we won't get into because don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But yeah, rugby has this kind of problem. They're trying to introduce the rule changes. I actually really like that 50 kicking from your own half into the 22 rule. You could probably have done it a few years ago potentially, but yeah, it'd be interesting how it gets on. I know it's on a trial run at the moment.
So that's, I suppose, our take on the URC. Like, there is a lot of things to watch out for. I think the key for the URC is, as much as trying to engage the average sports fan right across the 5 or so countries that are involved, I think the key is to make sure the match going fan is still happy with what's in front of them. And when Munster or Leinster host a Zebre, or when the South African sides or whatever it is, that there is still that element of competitive games. And what you're seeing before you is entertainment. So that's definitely something to watch out for. Of course, we'll have the Champions Cup, which is again another one that's looking to reform and move with the times, and that'll be interesting to watch over the next couple of years.
Final thing on the Champions Cup is still going with the format. So they've got 8 teams from England, 8 teams from France, 8 teams from what will now be the URC, but they're doing this tier thing again. You 4 group games, I think it is. So they're reducing the group games, and then you qualify either for the Champions Cup or the Challenge Cup. But it's not the same as, like, the best thing rugby ever had was the Heineken Cup, 20 teams. And I used to have the calculations of where Munster were, will they qualify, as the best fastest runners up, the best runners up, and that's gone now. And look, it's not like the French and English teams have done this because they prioritizing their own competitions, and then they don't want these. They didn't like these Irish sides winning, like Leinster winning or Leinster Munster winning all those Heineken Cups. So they've kind of tried their best to level the playing field in their favor.
Another key indicator maybe of why the Championship Cup the Champions Cup really hasn't had the success in the last years is, growing up, I think anyone listening might remember some of the Leinster games against Clermont Auvergne, or, even in the last few years, Leinster and Toulon, or whatever it is, or Biarritz. It doesn't really feel like there has been an unbelievable European game in Thomond Park, for example, in the last few years. Maybe, the last one might have been the game after Anthony Foley died, or some of the games you think of in the past. And maybe that is one of the key. They've got to try and build up the European Cup as much. It does feel like the URC and the European Cup maybe in a year or two could go head to head, or if a side's not in it because of the new qualification system. So, like, it is definitely something to keep an eye on going forward, because you want both products to be as good as each other. But there is that element that the European Cup should always, produce those moments that just stand out, and that they're, they're the ones that ultimately attract the casual fans more than the URC, as much as the URC are going to try and move it to. But that is, something, especially this year, if they can get right.
Last thing on that, so like the TV deal 10 years ago had RT, Munster, Leinster games, and then a deal with Sky, and now it's BT Sport, but also Virgin Media have their games, but they don't always have the first pick, because from memory they didn't have the semi-final or the Leinster semi-final from memory. But basically, they're showing the same game as Channel 4, which every Irish person has both channels. You're like, geez, can you not have a way of showing both games? We're not showing the same game, so we can get more games in free to air. But that's just the deal they struck, unfortunately, which is some rugby as opposed to no rugby. But it just means Virgin Media are showing Exeter against Glasgow instead of an Irish side that weekend. It's a bit frustrating.
Well, that's all we've got really for the show today on the United Rugby Championship. And again, we'll keep an eye on it as the season progresses, and make sure to check it out, because the season passes is an interesting new dynamic into what was the Magners League, the RaboDirect Pro12, then the 14, the 16, and now it's the United Rugby Championship.
I remember
But
checking the Celtic League. I remember checking the Celtic League on Teletext back in the day. So there you go.
there you go. I think it was the Magners League I first remembered. But we've got the November series coming up as well for Ireland, and it'd be a very important one for Andy Farrell to make sure he gets right ahead of the next Six Nations. So that's all for today on the Tackling Sport podcast. My thanks to Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone who got their comments in. Make sure to check out our YouTube channel or get us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and get us at social media. For those who are going to watch the Ryder Cup, make sure before you do to check out our preview show. We'll be back on Monday for another episode of the Tackling Sport podcast. Enjoy